Hi students! Today we'll be talking about the struggles that come with socialist regimes, particularly Nicaragua's government run by the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, or, in English, the Sandinista National Liberation Front. Located in Central America, in between Honduras and Costa Rica, and having gained independence in 1821, Nicaragua houses the region's largest lake, Lake Nicaragua, and the oldest city, León Viejo. Named after Nicarao, chief of the indigenous tribe which lived around Lake Nicaragua during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Nicaragua has had a strong influence of indigenous peoples, the country being mostly made up of mestizos, as Nicaragua has between 3/5 and 7/10 of the total population as mestizos, less than 1/5 of the total population are whites of European descent, and less than 1/10 of the population pertains to people of African descent and Indians among other groups. The west coast of Nicaragua has Spanish as the sole official language, while some east coast sections under the 1987 Constitution and the Atlantic Coast Autonomy Law dictated that Mestizo, Sumo, Rama, and Creole English shared equal status with Spanish because of the strong presence of indigenous peoples in these regions. Although Nicaragua does not have an official religion, there is more than half of the population adhering to Roman Catholicism, with evangelical Protestantism influencing 1/3 of the population with its popularity among the poor. Around 3/5 of the Nicaraguan population lives in urban centers such as the nation's largest city, Managua, and other important centers like León, Granada, and Chinandega. With such large urban centers, the cultural life in Nicaragua is rich with traditions rooted in the ethnic diversity in the Central American nation. As seen with the division of languages with the western and eastern parts of Nicaragua, the western part has folk traditions similar to other Latin American countries through arts and crafts, religious ceremonies, and corridos, country music, while the eastern part has more of an Afro-Caribbean background to their traditions. The largest country in Central America, Nicaragua is known as safe for traveling and tourism, which makes up a large portion of its economy along with agriculture. Here we have a picture of one of the present indigenous groups in Nicaragua, the Mezquitos, who have fought for and been granted semi-sovereign rights from the 1860 Treaty of Managua. Even so, this group, like other indigenous groups in Nicaragua, has been faced with relentless marginalization and mistreatment from the FSLN, which will be discussed deeper later in this presentation. Nicaragua has been able to emerge with many land, economic, and educational reforms backed by the FSLN, the socialist political party that participated in guerrilla warfare in retaliation to the 1980s U.S.-backed insurgency and Somoza government, and which gained much power throughout the nation, even though being temporarily defeated in 1990 by the National Opposition Union, backed by the United States, before once again gaining power in 2006. Although Nicaragua has been deemed as safe for tourists and has implemented many reforms, such as providing free health care, free education, and the Plan Techo for every single Nicaraguan family, this Central American nation has been subjected to internal turmoil due to riots throughout the country as opposition to Daniel Ortega's oppressive regime and human rights violations against protesters heightened in mid-April 2018. In order to further understand Nicaragua and the issues that permeate the country even after over 40 years of what should be seen as prosperity, there must be a closer inspection of the struggle for land, changing religious landscape, and U.S. imperialism in the nation. I wanted to quickly include these photographs that depict the FSLN in two different lights to showcase the different ways a political party can be seen by the people. In one way, it is important to note that the FSLN paved the way for many different reforms, such as free education for all Nicaraguans. Even so, it is also important to note that there has been systematic oppression under the Ortega regime, which had also been seen under the Somoza regime, ironic because the Sandinistas arose to dismantle the oppressive Somoza government's policies through acts such as land reform to appeal to the Nicaraguan citizens. Nicaragua has been faced with a struggle for land redistribution despite the government's implemented land reforms after the Sandinista revolution. While the Somoza regime, riddled with degeneracy, corruption, and brutality until their toppling by the Sandinistas in 1980, prioritize expert-driven, privately and foreign-owned farms, the Sandinista regime enforced land reforms that would decrease the poverty and landlessness that permeated Nicaragua under the Somozas. These land reforms were characterized by stripping land ownership from large privately owned farms and granting land titles to peasants. Even so, much of the arable land was not opened to farmers who had only been given small acres of land that didn't guarantee suitable crop growth. We see this issue still prevalent in Nicaragua to this day, with small farmers not being given their proper lands, being forced to form cooperatives to assure a stronger agricultural economy. Additionally, we now see farms returning to the hands of privately owned and foreign companies rather than state companies and cooperatives, accounting for the lack of land and food security as well as the overall poverty and landlessness in the Central American nation that was expected to ensure a different reality to farmers due to the inadequacy of the socialist Sandinista regime. In terms of the relationship between church and state in Nicaragua, there has been a quick deterioration of said relationship under Ortega's regime. Although Ortega had managed to win the Nicaraguan presidential election under the slogan Christian Socialist Solidarity, as he had recognized the church's influence in advocating for his regime as well as his government's policies, the church has adopted liberation theology to fight against the oppression and clear human rights violations his regime enables in response to the protests against such violations. As such, the Catholic Church has been deemed as an enemy of the Ortega regime and suffered attacks in which hundreds of elite police and paramilitary forces stormed and attacked parishes without mercy, thus tying into the issues of the socialist Sandinista regime in dwindling the relationship between church and state, which should be linked rather than separated, as seen with other Latin American countries, because of the church's inclination to protect those being forcefully silenced by the oppressive government. A strong example to illustrate the rising separation of church and state in Nicaragua is this picture of Monsignor Silvio Jose Baez, a notable Nicaraguan protesting bishop. This bishop highlights that an authentic Catholic pastor would always side with the victims rather than the executioners. Monsignor Baez clearly depicts the ideology of liberation theology in response to an oppressive government as that of Daniel Ortega's socialist regime. Much of the failures with Nicaragua's present socialist Sandinista regime lie with U.S. imperialism in this Central American country. Issues arose between Nicaragua and the U.S. in the 1800s when the U.S. chose Panama for the site of the Transisthmian Canal, which would later be known as the Panama Canal. The Nicaraguan president at the time, President Zelaya, was furious and weakened diplomatic relations with the U.S. by making concessions to Germany and Japan for a competing canal. As U.S. imperialism in Latin America is focused on consolidating the control over these nations, U.S. political and military intervention were clearly seen in the presidential election and re-election of conservative Adolfo Diaz, although he was despised throughout Nicaragua. The U.S. protected its own interests in Nicaragua with the implementation of treaties such as the Chamorro-Bryan Treaty, which secured U.S. interests against potential foreign countries and transformed Nicaragua into a near U.S. protectorate. The U.S. consolidation of power was met by opposition from civilians such as Augusto Cesar Sandino, who had organized peasants and workers around the injustices and poverty they suffered, as well as the need to change the political system implemented by U.S. imperialism in Nicaragua. Here is a picture of Augusto Sandino, who had led peasants and workers in a rebellion against the U.S.'s occupation of Nicaragua in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Deemed General of the Free Men and, later, a martyred symbol of resistance, Sandino had been assassinated by the U.S.-backed Somoza regime. His movement, Ejército Defensor de la Soberanía Nacional de Nicaragua, EDSN, or, in English, Army in Defense of the National Sovereignty of Nicaragua, during the rebellion was succeeded by the present-day FSLN, who had managed to overthrow the Somoza regime in 1979. In making this presentation about Nicaragua, I learned about all the different interlinings that make up a nation. More importantly, I found how widely internal dissension spreads when there are multiple issues that disturb a wider section of individuals, as seen with the protests in Nicaragua occurring because of issues permeating Ortega's oppressive socialist regime, such as the struggle for land, changing religious landscape, and influence of U.S. imperialism. In stating what I had learned from making the project, my favorite part was definitely being able to research my mother's country of origin deeper and be able to share my knowledge of the country with others, even though with topics not as ideal such as tourism or culture. I was very interested in delving into what makes a nation, and I am very glad I had been able to research a country that I had not very much prior knowledge about, other than stories from my mother's side of the family about their country of origin, tying into what I liked most about this course. Although this course was very broad, I had been given the opportunity to link the topics we discussed in the course into current events concerning Nicaragua, which was very essential for this final presentation. Thank you.